miss traveling now?
Oh, yes, I do, absolutely. But Norway is a long country, so I'm traveling now in Norway.
From you're in the north of Norway?
Yeah, I'm in the north in an island group called Vesterålen, and it's so beautiful here. And we almost have midnight sun already.
Ooh. This is something we never experienced. We have a very moderate day, you know, day and night. We have very clear. I mean, it stays like 1 hour or less for it to get dark. So when I travel to Europe, sometimes the north of Europe, and you have like till 10, and you still have light in the sky. That's really weird for me. Yeah, but that's the beauty of traveling. مساء الخير، معاكم شريف بكر من العربي النشر والتوزيع. معانا النهارده الكاتبه النرويجيه إيريكا فاتلاند، وهنتكلم عن كتابها بوردرز او الحدود. الكتاب ده هي عملته كانت بتحاول تزور، لقت ان الاتحاد السوفيتي يبعد دوله واحده، يعني له حدود مع النرويج وحدود مع 14 دوله اخرى، وهو يعتبر اكبر دوله في العالم. فقررت تزور وتلف، تزور ال 14 دوله اللي حوالين الاتحاد السوفيتي وتشوف اثر الاتحاد السوفيتي عليه. هنسالها عن الكتاب ده. احنا كان لينا فيديو معاها قبل كده عن كتابها الاولاني اللي نشرناه سوفيستان، انصحكم بيه، وهو زياره للدول اللي كانت محتله من الاتحاد السوفيتي وتحولت لستانات، فهم 5 دول. وكتبت عنه، وكتابها الجديد ده مرشح لجوائز كتيره وكان الاكثر مبيعا، ولها كتاب ثالث كمان يمكن هنعمله بقى، هنشوف ولا لا، بس مستنيين رايكم في ده. نبتدي معاها الحوار دلوقتي وهي معانا من النرويج. Good morning, Erika. How are you? We're pleased to have you with us talking about your book, new book in Arabic, Borders. It's not the newest book. You have a newer book now, which is a bestseller in Norway, I think. It's called Hi. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is really interesting. We can talk about it together at the end because it's really interesting also to do this book as well. But let's talk about borders. Why the Russian, and why not visiting Russia itself? I mean, if you want to talk about Russia, why to go to 14 countries to talk about Russia?
Good morning. I'm very happy now that some of my books are out in Arabic, and I've heard that being translated to Arabic is actually quite rare. So I'm very, very happy, and I hope that I will have some readers in the Arab world. Maybe one day I will be able to read the Arab translation myself.
Would be great.
So why write about Russia from the outside? Well, that was the whole idea. And the idea about writing about Russia from the outside came to me in a dream. I was then writing Sovietistan, which we talked about earlier in the other video. And I was then already planning for my next book and trying to find a good idea, because I mean, I don't have a normal job, so I need to have good ideas. And then one night I dreamt I was walking on a map, a huge map like that in back behind you, and I was walking from country to country on that map, but north of the red line there was always the same country, Russia. So when I woke up, I had the idea, I had the title, the border, I had the plan for the next years ready. I decided to write a book about what it means to be the neighbor of the biggest country in the world, because Russia, it's our neighbor in the north of Norway. We have a small border with Russia, but North Korea is a neighbor of Russia as well. So there are 14 countries with this same experience. What does it mean to have the biggest country in the world as your neighbor?
Did you research history before going? Because I mean, there's a lot of history, wars and history between Russia and their neighbors.
I did study Russian history at university, so I knew Russian history, and when you know Russian history, you automatically know a lot of history about the neighbors as well, because many of the countries that I visited used to be part of the Russian Empire and became independent in 1991 when the Soviet Union fell apart.
Mm-hmm. I will ask a technical question here about financing such a trip, because such a trip would cost a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of traveling, hotels, transportation, accommodation, food. Who pays for all this?
Yeah, it was an extremely expensive research journey. Also because some of these countries are quite expensive to visit. Like if you go to North Korea, you cannot just go to North Korea on your own. You have to join a tour. So that's quite expensive.
And the one on the north, the very north part of Russia, the small island you were talking about, that was really, really also very expensive in an old ship that started the book. It's the end of the trip.
Yeah, the book starts with a journey through the Northeast Passage along the northern coastline of Russia. And it was very important for me to have this part of the Russian border in the book, because the longest border of Russia, although it has 14 neighbor countries, but the longest border is the coastline. And I think today, with everything that's going on in the Arctic, you now see Russia trying in the UN to get more rights in the Arctic. You also see China getting involved. There are a lot of resources in the Arctic that when the ice is melting, it's becoming more available. And maybe the sea route through the Northeast Passage will also maybe become a popular route in the future, because it shortens the way from, say, Japan and Korea to Northern Europe tremendously. You don't have to go through the already very crowded Suez Channel. So this was very important for me to have in the book. But the problem is that as of today, and when I wrote the book, almost no ships are going this route. Many reasons for that, among others, because there is still ice in the area. So my problem was all the time, how will I find this boat? First I tried to find a cargo ship, but there were no ships that made the whole passage. And then in the last moment, actually just a few months before the book was to be published in Norway, I found a New Zealand adventure company that were making this trip for the very first time. And the ticket cost was enormous. It cost
$20,000. Yeah.
And it was no luxury trip at all. You had to share a cabin with someone. There was a toilet in the hallway. There was no casino or anything like that.
A typical Russian.
The Russian boat.
Yes.
But still very expensive, of course, because it's a very long expedition. It took 4 weeks. So I was lucky to find some sponsors in Norway who believed in the book and who would pay that part of the journey. And I think I'm lucky to come from a small country, and of course also a rich country. So there are for writers, for artists, there are some possibilities to get support if you need financial help for a project, and you find people who believe in you.
And I think it paid off at the end. The book is really a bestseller. How many languages it's being translated now?
I'm not quite sure. I know that Sovietistan is translated to about 26 languages, and the border maybe 18. I'm not 100%.
But still, I mean, it's I see with also it's nominated to prizes and everything. So I think it will be even more and more spread around, and it's an interesting. I mean, my only concern was the size of the book, because you give it, you go to a lot of countries, so if you just write few pages, that makes a big book. But it was really interesting for the Arab reader. We don't really like all these big books sometimes. It's kind of a lot, but I think it's a beautiful journey. You just start and you never end. You don't want it to end, and you have a lot of questions. Which brings us also to the logistics of traveling with all the visas and everything. I know that the Norwegian passport is probably strong and easily to get, because you were talking about getting a certificate from your family to get to North Korea, which is not easy. You will tell us this story, but I want to tell you that it's the same for Egyptians to go to Europe. You have to get, I think they will, in the future, not in the future, actually now, they will ask like for a blood sample and a gene test or something to make sure that you know, everything is okay and everything, but it's strange that you would have to face the same problem. Can you tell us about the logistics of getting 14 visas or traveling to 14 countries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, North Korea was the most difficult to enter, and also mainly because they don't like journalists. So I could, of course, not write that I was a journalist in my visa application. And the embassy in Stockholm, the North Korean embassy in Stockholm, they actually demand this certificate of where you work. And it's actually the first time that I've been asked to supply this certificate. And then I had to become creative because, I mean, I don't really have a job. I could not ask my publisher to make a certificate, but my family owns the biggest private slaughterhouse company in Norway. And I mean, I'm a vegetarian. I don't really like the meat industry. But finally, this
Ironic.
background came in handy, and I called to the slaughterhouse office and I asked, can you please make me a certificate that I work as a receptionist in the slaughterhouse? And they did that. So I went to North Korea officially as the receptionist of a slaughterhouse, and I think it was the best alibi I could have because like no one was interested in hearing about my boring job.
It's really interesting also that trip to North Korea. I expected it to be more interesting, that you would go, but it seems that they controlled you completely. You couldn't do much on your own. It was like everything was, you couldn't, huh?
If you read any travel description from North Korea, it's almost basically the same because they take the tourists to all the same places, to the museums, to the mausoleum, and you're very controlled. You are with two guides at all times because the guide control each other as well. And the most interesting part of the North Korean journey was that, I mean, since I was writing a book about the Russian border, I wanted to go north to actually see the Russian border, which is not very long. It's only 19 kilometers, but of course, important border. And so then I had to find a trip that would actually also take us to the north. And that the north of North Korea is very rarely visited by tourists. Most tourists only visit Pyongyang. And then sitting in the airplane from Pyongyang to the north of North Korea, I could actually understand why most people will not go there. It was absolutely terrifying. It was an old Soviet airplane. Anyway, the north of North Korea is interesting because it's even poorer than Pyongyang. I mean, Pyongyang is kind of a showcase window. It's where the privileged middle class and elite is living. But in the north, it's very different. It's very, very poor. You don't see many cars at all. People are very poorly dressed. So it's a very different atmosphere from Pyongyang. And also, what was most interesting to me was that our guides were less, I would say, they had less routine in the north since they don't really receive many tourists. So they were more interesting to talk to than the guides in Pyongyang who would, I mean, they were experts in not answering the questions that you actually asked them.
They're more experienced in this, but the others were just like naive. You can get things out of them. And do you know that the cellular company there is an Egyptian company that runs this? We have a lot of construction with North Korea, and the communication is run. I met actually the CEO who was an Egyptian living there, and he told me lots of stories, very interesting about living there, because he was one of the few who had the internet.
He should write a book.
Maybe, but actually he was doing an audio company, so maybe he would, that would be a good start for a company. But did you see there is a hotel, the longest hotel? There was a whole story about the hotel there. They had this very tall building in Pyongyang that was never operated, and it was.
It's still
but
not
they
finished.
Wouldn't show you this because it's also one of the shameful things they've done, so it wouldn't be of an interest. But yeah, I mean, interesting to go to such a strange countries. But you revisited some countries, as I see, from Sovietistan. How did you have to go to do the same visit again, or you just wrote from the past, or what would you do? Would you do this?
No. I did absolutely visit again, because from Sovietistan I had to visit Kazakhstan again. Kazakhstan has the longest border with Russia, so I sort of could not avoid Kazakhstan. And that's quite interesting to revisit a place that you've been before, because quite often I experience that I see the place differently. And that's quite interesting to think of, that how you experience a place also very much depends on your state of being, your mood, what you come from. I mean, when I first came to Kazakhstan, I came from Turkmenistan, and Turkmenistan is pretty much like North Korea outside of the capitalist world. So you don't have ATMs, you don't have all the like global brands that we are used to seeing everywhere. It's very, very isolated. So I remember coming to Kazakhstan and just being kind of so happy to see everything familiar. Sushi shops, ATMs, jeans, everything that you don't see in Turkmenistan. So I just remembered I was like so much looking forward to go to that place again, where I had that city where I had come from, to Turkmenistan, Aktau. And when I came there now, and I visited the same place, and I was just so disappointed because it was just a very boring, normal-looking mall. The sushi was honestly quite terrible. But when I came from Turkmenistan, it was like heaven.
So even the time of traveling and the mood, as you say, differs from one country to the other. You had a very interesting story about someone who would sleep at night in a country and wake up, find himself in another country, though he's in the same house.
Yeah, so that is a story from Georgia, and Datu Vanishvili is his name, an old man. And for me, Datu Vanishvili's story, it's kind of the whole, it summarizes the whole book for me. He is, for me, the Russian border. He symbolizes to me what it means to be the neighbor of the biggest country in the world. So the Caucasus is very complicated, and you have three countries: Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia, and you also have three breakaway republics: Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, where there was just recently a war, and you have South Ossetia. And South Ossetia was the only place that I was not able to go on this journey, because you cannot enter South Ossetia from Georgia. It's totally closed. I mean, officially, it's still a part of Georgia, but Georgia has no control on South Ossetia anymore. So you can only enter South Ossetia, the small breakaway republic, from Russia. And then what's happening in South Ossetia is that the Russians, who are really in control of this area, they are in the night. They are slowly expanding the territory. They're moving the border fence in the night. And the Russian, I mean, the Georgia is a small country, and being on their own with no support from Europe, from America, from any other country, there's really nothing they can do to stop this. And so Datu Vanishvili, man of about 80 years old, he had been living in Georgia all his life, Georgian citizen, lived in a Georgian village. And then one day he woke up, and during the night they had moved the border fence that used to be behind his house. Now it was in front of his house. Suddenly he was kind of trapped in South Ossetia. He was not in Georgia anymore. And it has caused him enormous problems. He cannot, I mean, he gets his pension. He has to, in the night, sneak through the fence to get his pension. But he will get his pension in lari, in Georgian money. He cannot use that money in South Ossetia. And his wife is very ill, so she cannot really move from the bed, from the house. So they are trapped in this breakaway republic. It's a terrible nightmare. And it was very dramatic to visit him, because as a foreigner, I couldn't just go there. I couldn't go so close to the border, because the Russians, they have cameras. So they see when you approach, and then they will come. And they have arrested people who have come too close to the border. So I had to go with I think I had 6 or 7 Georgian soldiers guarding me as I was doing this interview with a man who was on the other side of the fence.
You were literally talking across the borders.
Yes, I was in Georgia and he was on the other side of the fence in South Ossetia, and we talked across the border.
And do you know anything about him right now? I mean, do you have any news from him?
I'm afraid I don't know
Wow.
anything about him now.
That would be interesting to continue. I mean, would you, speaking of the USA, you were talking about America now, would you do the same? I mean, not borders of America because there are 2 countries, so not so many, but would you like go for the 52 states or of America? Would you travel something like this? Or not so interesting, or?
Maybe, but the thing is, we hear so much about America and USA already, and I think, I mean, if you watch Norwegian news on television, you could easily believe that Norway is a state of America because there is so much news from America all the time. And I actually think that this is very, very unbalanced. So as for now, I'm much more interested in discovering other parts of the world, which is totally undercovered.
Totally, I totally agree with you. But I think if you go, you will show us something different as well. Your vision will just filter what we see, and you will give us something beyond this. What if you have like $50,000 right now and you have to do your trip? Where would you go? What's the first thing you would do? Let's say that there's no more COVID, you can travel everywhere, you have access. What would be like your dream trip now?
Well, actually, I am now planning on a new book, and I hope it will be about Russia itself, not just the border, but actually Russia, the country. So let's see how it goes.
You're not intrigued by South America, you're not intrigued by Africa, Sahara, Sub-Sahara, or that's too hot for you, too far for you?
No, actually, I am also working on another project which involves quite a huge part of Africa and also South Asia. But that book project involves visiting 25 countries. And I've just realized I have to postpone it. Actually had my original plan was to start this fall on this big project, but with the corona situation, I think it would be very, very difficult to do this now. So that's why
I think you will have to get a lot of vaccination as well. You have to get, if you travel to Africa, you'll have to get a lot of vaccination and a lot of logistically. It's not as easy as in Europe, of course. But yeah, that would be also interesting. And what about the corona? What have you been doing last year and a half now? I mean, you're traveling inside Norway. Is this enough, or are you writing, reading, Googling?
Well, I was lucky kind of when the pandemic started. I was in the midst of writing my news book about the Himalaya, so I wasn't planning on traveling anyway. I was just traveling in my head.
Remember.
So I haven't been that hard hit. But yes, doing the travel once more in my head. But when the pandemic struck in March last year, me and my husband, he's also a writer, so we often escape the Norwegian winter. And that year we had gone really far. We were in French Polynesia, like literally on the other side of the earth. And then suddenly the borders started closing and we were very, very far from home. So it became a little bit dramatic. We had to go home very quickly.
Okay, but I mean, brings us also to the way that you write when you travel. Do you take notes? Do you record things? Do you take photos? I noticed you have few photos in the book, but do you take more? I mean, I'm a photo fanatic, so I take like, I don't know, when we were together, I took like 1,000 photos at that day. I take everything. It's kind of, I'm afraid I'm gonna lose my memory one day. So photos is always brings you to the, you know, that spot that you start easily to remember. So do you take photos, notes, voice notes, and then, or you write directly and then you rewrite when you go home and edit? How does it work?
I do take a lot of photos. I like photographing, and people often complain that they would like to have even more photos in my books. And I also use the photos to help my memory, because you can't really trust your memory. So to remember how someone looked like or what a place looked like, I often look at the photos. And then when I travel with a small computer and I take notes every day. And then my method is very adapted to the situation. So sometimes I can do, if it's with a politician, I would do a formal interview. I would record so that I can prove that he really said what he said he said. Sometimes I take notes during the interview. Sometimes, like in North Korea, I could not tell anyone I was writing a book. So then I just had to try to remember what everyone said and write it down at night at the best of my memory.
In Norwegian, of course, not English. Or any different language, so nobody can read.
I write some books in Norwegian anyway. And then I use these notes as like a raw material when I get home and I start writing the book.
Yeah, but writing all this, do you write everything and then you start to edit, or you decide to edit from the beginning? I wouldn't tell this story, because I'm sure you had far more stories than what you wrote, and it can make like a huge book if you do this. So you have to edit, or your editor in the publishing house talks to you about parts. Because also you have to have, I think, the right balance. Not to say too much, not to say too little, not to go too politics, not to go too social. It's always very difficult. I think that's a process, an excellent process for a writer and editor, is like to find the right, because also it's now you know that it's an international book. Lots of other readers, it's not only Norwegian, who I know that they love these huge books. The more book it is, it means more, but you have, you're catering for a bigger audience now.
That's always a long process, editing. What I try to do when I try to write things that I find interesting myself, because I think if I find this interesting, then I hope that the reader will find it interesting too. So that is always my number one rule. And of course, from my travel, for doing research for the border, I traveled 259 days. And when you read the book, most of these days are not mentioned at all, because nothing interesting happens. That's reality also when you travel. Not every day is very interesting. A lot of days are just very boring. But then when I write the book, I try to bring out the highlights, what I found interesting, what sheds the light on the topic.
Could you tell us a little bit about High, or your new book, or the latest book? Because this also another travel, but it's upwards, I think.
So this book is not about the Soviet Union or Russia. It's about another very interesting part of the world, the Himalaya. And this book is actually even thicker than the border. It's 600 pages in Norwegian. I think in Arabic it would be even longer. Because this region is so extremely interesting. And what I discovered is that actually there was no book about the whole region. So I wanted to write about all the countries who are part of the Himalaya. So that's Pakistan, North India, Bhutan, Nepal, and China. And of course, this is not a book about China or India. It's just about the Himalayan region. And it's one of the regions in the world where most languages are spoken. And there are so many different cultures in this mountain region. You find all the biggest religions in the world. You find Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and also a lot of shamanistic, animistic religions. And then politically, it's also an extremely interesting region. You can kind of see the Himalaya as a physical border between China and India, the most populous countries in the world. And when you look at the maps of Himalaya, you see that the borders, the international borders, many places, they just disappear because there is no agreement of where the border is going. So you have Kashmir, and you also have the border between India and China, which is disputed. So it's just an extremely fascinating region. And my aim then was not to write about mountaineering or climbing a high mountain, which is what Westerners usually do when they go to Himalaya. I wanted to write a book about the people living there.
Okay, why don't you write then, I mean, your career, I mean, why don't you write about a novel about this? I mean, wouldn't you use a novel like a fiction? I mean, I know that you write very well fiction as well, but I mean, I love this literary kind of travel books, but don't you think you can do like, would you do this? Would you switch to something like this at the end? Happening in this area?
Maybe one day, but then maybe I would not. I mean, if I'm writing a book about the Himalaya, I don't think I would write a novel, because to write a novel, it has maybe to be about a topic that is more internalized, that you have inside you. And yeah, I have been thinking about writing a novel, but then I also find the world so fascinating. There's so many interesting things to write about, and often the stories that you encounter in the real world, they are wilder and more fascinating than anything you could just write from your fantasy.
You know, also for our readers and people who watch us, we met in person in 2016 in Estonia, in Tallinn, in Estonia. It was a literary festival. We were a group of international, I mean, I think I was the only publisher, but we were mostly authors and poets from around the world. And we had a program, and we had to eat together and travel a little bit and this. But you were always kind of a loner in the group, which that's my recollection of this. I mean, I remember even they had like a tour, a walking tour in the city center, where we see that. And you said, no, I'm not coming. You just came in the morning, said hi, and then I will just go walk alone. And I like to explore. You have your own agenda, which I felt like, why is she going out of the group? I mean, everybody's together here. Why is she not with us? But then years later, I discovered why. Probably you were doing also your research, or I don't know. Do you remember, or do you have an explanation for this?
Yeah, I do remember, and you're right. I was at that moment, I was very busy doing research for the border, and I was, of course, I mean, Estonia is also a neighbor country of Russia, so I was doing research for the border when I was in Tallinn with you. So that's why I didn't really have time for all the socializing, because I knew that I could not write about what we experienced at the literature festival would not be interesting to have in the book. So I needed to do some other research while I was in Tallinn.
Okay, and what about not next projects? You said you have a lot of next projects. When the travel is removed and you can travel, where would be the first place you would go now?
Okay, so I already said I'm hoping my next book will be about Russia, which I still find a very fascinating country. And now I have traveled around Russia. I think it's time to go inside of Russia. And Russia is so much more than just Putin and Moscow and St. Petersburg. I mean, it's the biggest country in the world, so obviously there are so much to say about Russia. And
is your book translated to Russian?
Yeah, it is. The border is translated to Russian and Sovietistan as well.
I mean, was it well received, or?
Yeah, it was actually well received. I'm very glad that the border was translated to Russian, because there was kind of a scandal in Russia before the book was published, because then I gave an interview to a Danish newspaper when the book was published in Danish. And then the journalist asked me, so what do you think will happen with the Russian border in the future? And I said, well, that's very difficult to say. I don't know. And then he asked me again, but what do you think? And then I said that, well, the Russian border has changed a lot over the centuries. It's constantly moving. So I think in 100 years, I don't think the Russian border will look the same as today. I think it will, I added, I think it will be smaller than today because it's very, very large. I think it will be smaller. And then this interview, which I gave to a Danish newspaper, was picked up by Russian journalists who translated the interview to Russian. And the interview was published in online Russian newspapers. And every time it appeared, it was, it had changed. So the last headlines were like, the Norwegian social anthropologist Erika Fatland predicts
the fall of Russia.
And I had to close my Instagram and Facebook and Twitter accounts because I received so many hate messages from Russians. So I'm very glad that now they can read the book for themselves and actually see what it's about.
Interesting that you can get hate from everywhere, but also people not that tolerant when they read about themselves. And in the English edition of your book, the publisher added at the very end like an updated info of some of the things that happened, because you finish at a certain time and then lots of things happened after that. Would you keep updating the editions? Would you like? And he transformed, like, sometimes the currency, when you talk about something, he transferred them to sterling pounds, the measurements, and sometimes this person was in prison, he's now out, or he was not in prison, now he's in prison, he died. Because you were at some points, at some very critical moments in the country that you pass by in Sovietistan and borders, and things do change. Would you don't mind this kind of an updated version of the book every now and then?
Well, it depends. I mean, if the book is published, say, in another language, like 5 years after it was published in Norway, I think it's natural that the editor updates certain things so that the reader will know that this and this has changed. I will not myself update the border because there are just too many countries, 14 countries. They are all changing all the time, of course. So, I mean, it's impossible to keep it totally updated. It's like an image of what these countries were like when I traveled there. I mean, in China, when I wrote the border, the situation in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs were much better than it is today. We did not know then about the camps where 1 million Uyghurs are kept in prison. So when the border was published, this was not knowledge that I had. And of course now this is knowledge that we have. So that changes constantly. When it comes to Sovietistan, I have an afterword that I keep updating. Maybe because Sovietistan is more, it's a book about those five countries, what they are like. So I think it's nice to keep the afterword slightly updated on the most important changes. I mean, after I visited Uzbekistan, the dictator died. The eternal president of Kazakhstan resigned. So there's been some very important changes that I have.
You were lucky charm. You were a lucky charm for the dictatorship. Things do change after that. Well, we would still extend our invitation for you to come to Cairo. I remember we had a Finnish author coming from the north of Finland to Cairo, and it was a very strange visit for us because we had a lot of authors coming from all around the world for our books, but he was one of the most different because, I mean, he didn't want to visit the pyramids, he didn't want to go to the museum or to eat Egyptian food, but his comment was always that Egypt, I mean, for him it was so noisy, which is, I didn't recognize that much, but when I talked later and he had fun, he was enjoyable, we loved him, but it was this social differences when we were discussing that he said that, I mean, coming from the north of Finland is like, you know, there's no sound whatsoever. And to come to the middle of Cairo of a 22 million people talking around you, I always discover that I have a higher pitch when I travel, because in Cairo, I have to talk over the crowded, outside the crowded streets. There's always something in the background. There's always someone, music, stuff. So that's always a challenge. So I'm wondering, when you come, what would you say about Cairo? And also, we were once comparing with also Scandinavian, I think, publisher, who wanted to come to Cairo or to the Middle East in general to see the difference between the wind over the sand versus the wind over the snow. And that was the most strange thing I've ever heard at that time. It's like, who cares? I mean, it's wind, it's... But then I stopped and I started to think, and I said, well, there must be differences. I mean, if she finds this is interesting, and this, maybe we just don't know, we want to go to a shopping mall maybe, or we want to go to a museum, or we want to go to the traditional part, but things are really different between us. Do you embrace these differences? Do you like it? Do you find it strange?
Well, I have no idea how I would react to Cairo, to visiting Cairo, but I've been wanting to visit Egypt for a very long time, and I mean, it's a super interesting country and with a very, very rich history. So it's a country that I look much forward to discover. So I hope to not only be able to visit Cairo, but also to see more of Egypt, because Egypt is, I mean, of course, a very big country.
Okay, so thank you very much for the interview. We just want one last question for something in Arabic for our readers again. I mean, if you have something more. You can say thank you very much or something in Arabic. I think this is easy.
And now you just, well, it's Eid is over. I could say Eid Mubarak, Kul Am wa Antum Bikhair.
Wow, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Erika. We loved your interviews. We loved your books. You now have 2 books, Sovietistan and Borders in Arabic. And we're looking forward for more books. And we're looking forward to you visiting the Middle East and Egypt after all this is done. Thank you very much for your time and the interview.
Thank you, Marwan.
Thank you.